All right, let's start our fifth unit on the self. I think sometimes when people encounter this unit, they maybe think it's kind of a step backward in terms of complexity or kind of the building we're doing on topics this semester. But I want to try to emphasize how central the self is to all the different things that we do in our social world, because a lot of times we are taking the feedback we're getting from the social world and it's reflecting back on ourselves. Maybe we are defining the things that we see in terms of the way that we think about ourselves. So the self really is a central concept in thinking about our social world, even if it feels like it's a little bit separated from it. So in this unit, we are going to talk about what the self is, where it comes from. We'll talk about how we present ourselves, some things that have to do with self-esteem and self-control, and we'll talk about self-monitoring, but we will hold that for our synchronous session to talk about that a little bit more. Um, but again, people, sometimes think that maybe this topic is a little too basic in some ways, but I would argue that you just need to look toward pop culture and entertainment to see all the ways that people are really interested in learning about the self and how the self can be a central, plot point or even plot device in a lot of pieces of entertainment. If you just take movies, there are a couple of prominent themes or prominent like paradigms that people use in movies to show how important self-knowledge and like a concrete sense of self really is. Some movies deal with amnesia, so the loss of information about the self. And this might take the form of anterograde amnesia, amnesia for things moving forward in time, usually since an injury or an event. Uh, in this case, the film Memento, that perhaps some of you have seen, although it is getting rather old at this point. But it's a movie about somebody who's trying to unravel a mystery, but he can't form new memories. Kind of in the same way that Dory from the Finding Nemo and Finding Dory movies, she also, lives moment to moment. So that quality for those characters has important implications for what they know about themselves and how other characters treat them, and at times perhaps even manipulate them, right? The other type of amnesia, not the forward in time kind, but the backward in time kind, retrograde amnesia, comes up a lot too. Again, I'm dating myself talking about these movies even, but perhaps you at least know what they are. The Vow with Rachel McAdams and Channing Tatum, or The Bourne Identity with Matt Damon, or even The Notebook kind of fits into these too. Another old one. I'm sure there are newer examples. I'm just not necessarily aware of them. But in these examples, people lose their sense of self entirely, perhaps because of an illness or a head injury or something like that, and they don't know who they are. So, how does a person who does not know who they are navigate the world? Well, they're not tied to their social realities in the same way that they were, moments prior. So, these are all good examples of how a consistent, concrete sense of self really grounds characters and grounds likely how people interact with their worlds. Now, another slightly different type of portrayal of the self in entertainment and film is a body swap type comedy, usually a comedy. Although I think you can make a good case that a lot of these things could double as like horror tropes too. But as far as the body swap in recent entertainment, I think there was a movie called like The Change Up or something with Jason Bateman and Ryan Reynolds like 10 years ago, where they both like peed into the same fountain and got electrocuted by lightning or something, and they switch bodies. So that happens. But another one that you might be familiar with is a children's book that came out in 1972 called Freaky Friday, where a mother and a daughter that don't see eye to eye switch bodies. If you don't know about that, maybe you know about the 1976 film called Freaky Friday. It had Jodie Foster in it, and it is a tale of a mother and daughter who don't see quite eye to eye and they switch bodies. If you didn't know about that one, maybe in 95, if you're old enough, you saw a Disney Channel movie with Shelley Long in it about a mother and daughter who don't see quite eye to eye and switch bodies. If not, maybe about 8 years later, you were a Lindsay Lohan fan or a Jamie Lee Curtis fan. You saw this movie called Freaky Friday, where mother and daughter don't quite see eye to eye and they switch bodies. If you missed out on all of those, there was a musical in 2018 called Freaky Friday, where a mother and a daughter don't see quite eye to eye and switch bodies. But that was really just a pretext for a Disney Channel movie called Freaky Friday that was adapted from it, where a mother and daughter who don't quite see eye to eye switch bodies. In that one, I'm not familiar with any of the people in it. Perhaps you are, or perhaps you've even seen it. Anyway, this is my long, stupid walk to show you that even if this has been made many, many times before, this idea that we might see someone's perspective in a very literal way by like inhabiting their body is a very useful plot device, right? It's not only in this perpetually adapted property, Freaky Friday, but it happens across lots of different types of media. So either losing your sense of self or having to contend with like gaining someone else's sense of self is a very popular way of looking at a person or a character. So to show how you might think about yourself and then to draw some distinctions, I want you to do a quick activity. You can either type these out or write them down on a sheet of paper, but I do want you to pause and do this so you can actually have your responses in hand and kind of compare them to what I'm going to tell you. But this is a common psychological assessment about the self used in research, and as far as I know, sometimes it's also used in therapies in certain ways, but primarily in research. And all you need to do is stop and write down 20 responses finishing the statement, I am. I'm not going to give you specifics about it because you can write anything you want after that, but just try to come up with 20 as freely as you can. Don't put too much pressure on it. Write them in the order that they occur to you, and then play once you're done. So pause if you haven't yet. And if you're finished, I will continue on to talk about why I had to do this. Okay, so this is a task, like I said, called the 20 statements task, and it is just something to get people thinking about themselves and trying to externalize some of that internal knowledge that you obviously have accumulated about yourself over your lifetime. And researchers that look at these statements have taken to separating them into different categories. One of the categories that people tend to write things that fit into is independent, or are independent statements. So these might be things about traits like I am shy, I am outgoing, I am funny. It might be something about a particular role that you fill, like I am a musician, something like that, or like a set of qualities that you have, a kind of qualities mixed with a role, like I am a good listener, for example. But really anything that fits into the idea that you are describing yourself in a vacuum, kind of independent of other people, that qualifies as one of these independent statements. The other side of the coin are two different classes of interdependent statements. So interdependent statements, both of the types that I'm going to talk about, refer to statements you would make about yourself that reference other people, whether implicitly or explicitly. So an interdependent statement might be something like, I am a sister or a brother or a sibling. And these say something about the person, but they only mean something in the context of the relationship that's relevant for that person. So only having another sibling makes you a sibling, right? So these can be relatively narrow or relatively broad in how people construe them. The narrower ones are what we would call relational interdependent statements. They're ones about a specific relationship that you have with a specific person or small group of people. Like I am a daughter. That might refer to your role with respect to your parents. Even though that's two people, that still fits with a relational type of statement. Or I am best friends with my roommate. Might be another relational statement talking about a specific role in a specific relationship. The other type of interdependent statement is a collective interdependent statement. So it talks about your membership in some type of group that might be, medium-sized to relatively diffuse. So Ones on the smaller or medium side are things like I am a member of X sorority or fraternity, or I am a member of my soccer team, or I am a member of my Dungeons and Dragons guild, or something like that. That you have a group that you belong to that's a little broader than just your family unit or something like that. Going broader still, you might say something like I am a Piper or I am a Hamlin student, and you're talking about a relationship that you have to an institution and a group of people, even though you don't know all of the people in that group, right? There are other people who might say I am a Hamlin student or I am a Piper that you have never met and never will meet, but you share that type of collective designation with one another. The same way that you might say, I am an American, or I am a black person, or I'm a person who stays true to Islam, or I am a human being, right? These are all collective statements that we might make that describe our association with a group that might happen to be quite large. Um, so remember the designation between independent and interdependent, and within interdependent, there are two categories, relational and collective types of statements. So once researchers have kind of described the world of possible statements you might make in here, and this does cover the broad, I mean, not every single literal statement you could make, but this covers the vast majority of them. What else can we look at here? If we look at cultural differences, I've talked briefly about a distinction you're probably already aware of between Western and Eastern cultures. Western cultures being more individualistic, Eastern cultures being more group oriented and collectivistic. If you look at the differences between Western and Eastern cultures, you might be unsurprised to find that Western cultures emphasize independent statements on the I am task, and Eastern cultures emphasize interdependent statements on the I am task. And this, fits into our broad understanding of what Eastern and Western divides, or individualistic and collectivistic divides, are like. But if you look at the actual data from a study that looked at this, I mean, there are many studies that have examined this, but here's just one example to emphasize that independent statements still happen to be the most common. They're the most salient things for people, no matter what culture they tend to come from. It's just that the proportions of these statements tend to differ. So in this study, they put people on kind of a rough spectrum from people that identified more as European American, people that were unidentified, identified as Asian American, and Korean, or simply Korean. At this particular university, those were like the largest groups they were able to put together. And this is, roughly a spectrum from Western identification to East Asian identification. And you can see that the gap between independent and interdependent statements is the largest on this end of the scale, right? And that gap narrows as you go over to more East Asian identification. And on average, there still are more statements that are independent, but the proportion is different. So it's closer to a one-to-one sort of proportion over here with East Asian identification, and more almost about a 2-to-1 ratio here of independent to interdependent statements for people identifying with Western culture. So this is one of those instances where our data, it does fit this general idea that we have, that Western cultures value independence, Eastern cultures value interdependence, but actually they both value interdependence. It's just the degree to which they tend to do it. Excuse me. Other differences I could mention here, gender differences and interdependence. I think a lot of times people are surprised to find that there isn't a similar gender difference, such that like men are saying more independent things and women are saying more interdependent things. It's actually the case that the ratios for interdependence to independent to interdependent are relatively equal between men and women. They don't really differ that much in the proportions that they use those different things. They do differ, however, in the types of interdependent statements that they end up saying. Women tend to emphasize relational interdependence, so about specific relationships with specific people and the social roles that are involved in those. Men tend to emphasize collective interdependence. So the more broad and diffuse groups that they might belong to, like I'm in a fraternity, or I'm a Vikings fan, or something like that. Um, so now that we've kind of covered some of those initial ways that you might think about the self, in the next video I'm going to talk a little bit more about this social construction of the self and move on to a few more specific topics.